เดินไปดู
วางตรงกลางนี่ก่อนจะได้เป็นการมาเนี่ยช่วงบล็อกกลางเนี่ยถ้ายังไม่มาบอกเขาว่าเดี๋ยวเปิดแซมให้
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This afternoon it is a very special one. Let me welcome all of you. And also let me start our opening session. Mr. Jame D Wolfensohn, Excellencies, Mr. Maraves, distinguished guests, University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, administrators, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the special lecture on Beyond East-West North-South Peace and Prosperity in a four-speed world. Again, it is a very great honor for the university to host such a special speech by the internationally recognized and renowned speaker. For those who have been here for several times, may I say to you, welcome home. In a few minutes, we will start the welcome remark with Assistant Professor Dr. Sawani Thayarungrod, the Vice President for Research. May I now have the honor of Assistant Professor Dr. Sawani Thayarungrod, the Vice President for Research, to give a welcome speech about this great event.
Mr. Jame D Wolfensohn, Excellencies, Mr. Maraves, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, may I welcome all of you to a special lecture co-organized by the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and the International Peace Foundation. It is an honor for us to have Mr. Jame D Wolfensohn as our guest speaker on the very significant topic of Beyond East, West, South, North, Peace and Prosperity in a four-speed world. As we are well aware that poverty has always been the first priority of world agenda, the World Bank is one of many organizations which plays a vital role in economic boost and in poverty reduction. Mr. Wolfensohn's past experience as the president of the World Bank and his lecture today will give you an inspiration to help to eliminate world poverty, restore peace and prosperity. According to the United Nations, about 25,000 people die every day of hunger for hunger or hunger-related causes, although there is plenty of food in the world for everyone. The problem is that hungry people are trapped in severe poverty. Their malnourishment finally results in sickness and death. Another factor which is tremendously involved in the world poverty crisis is the speedy globalization. Economic globalization has linked the North, the South, the East, and the West together in some ways. However, what needs to be urgently developed are peace culture and community building. In order to achieve this, we must cooperate in generating people's ideas and knowledge together. We need to continue promoting greater contacts between us at all levels to create mutual appreciation and understanding among youths, grown-ups, and a strong belief in the value of peace. This special lecture on Beyond East, South, East, West, South, North, Peace and Prosperity in a four-speed world will provide a forum for interested participants to exchange ideas and cooperation regarding the issue on global peace and prosperity in our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assistant Professor Dr. Sawani Thairuron for your warm welcome. And at this moment, I would like to invite Mr. Ove Moraves, Chairman of the Board of Directors in the National Peace Foundation, to deliver his opening address.
สวัสดีครับ and welcome to the first ASEAN-wide event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including some of the country's major universities. Having started in November 2007, Bridges is continuously held in Thailand and the Philippines until April 2008, involving the participation of Nobel laureates and other eminent keynote speakers. The first ASEAN series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. It follows the Bridges series, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand between November 2003 and April 2005. The pluralistic forum of Bridges highlights the International Peace Foundation's intercultural and transdisciplinary approach towards peace. The foundation doesn't take sides, but acts as a mediator by creating an independent platform for dialogue where representatives of science, politics, economy, culture, religion, the media, and youth can meet, share their viewpoints, listen to each other, and find mutual ways of understanding and cooperation. Therefore, the foundation itself is a bridge and a facilitator between different language groups in our divided societies, where politicians speak another language than artists, and business and religious leaders another one than scientists. In a highly interdependent world, problems cannot be solved by either one of these language groups only, but by finding ways of working together. After the success of Bridges in Thailand, the International Peace Foundation has been invited by other ASEAN countries to build further bridges towards peace and international understanding by expanding its program beyond Thailand to stimulate the intellectual, scientific and cultural exchange in the region. The first ASEAN Bridges series therefore continuously takes place in Thailand and the Philippines from November 2007 to April 2008, comprising events with Nobel laureates from all fields, as well as other keynote speakers who visit the region not all at once but separately to conduct public lectures, seminars, workshops and dialogues hosted by local institutions during a continued period of 6 months. The topics of the ongoing events deal with the overall theme of building a culture of peace and development in a globalized world, and with a wide range of issues in the field of politics, economy, science, culture and the media. They especially highlight the challenges of both globalization and regionalism and its impact on development and international cooperation. The aim of Bridges is to facilitate and strengthen dialogue and communication between societies in Southeast Asia with their multiple cultures and faiths, as well as with peoples in other parts of the world, to promote understanding and trust. The events aim at building bridges with local universities and other institutions in Southeast Asia to establish long-term relationships with Nobel laureates, experts, and decision makers, which may result in common research programs and other forms of collaboration. By enhancing science, technology, and education as a basis for peace and development, the events aim and may lead to a better cooperation for the advancement of peace, freedom, and security in the region, with the active involvement of the young generation, ASEAN's key to the future. This is why Bridges is not designed as a one-time event, but as a continuing process of synergies to make this series of events a sustainable success for Thailand, for the Philippines, and for Southeast Asia as a whole. I am grateful to the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and its president, Dr. Chiradet Ausawat, as well as to our other partners and sponsors who have enabled us to make the idea of Bridges a reality. I would like to thank all of you present today for taking part in this program. May it help us to facilitate a new culture of peace through dialogue, transcending its definition as merely the absence of war or armed conflict into a new understanding what the basis for peace really is: education. In this spirit, we welcome today the former president of the World Bank, Mr. Jame D Wolfensohn, who has agreed to come to Thailand to support the events. We all look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Khop khun krab.
Welcome, Mr. Morales. Thank you very much. And now, it's time for the highlight of this very special event. This afternoon, I have the singular honor and privilege of introducing our distinguished keynote speaker, Mr. Jame D Wolfensohn, whose great experiences, honors, and awards are hard to tell in such a very short time. Let me briefly introduce him to you. Mr. Jame D Wolfensohn was born in Australia and is a naturalized US citizen. He holds a Bachelor degree of Arts and Law from the University of Sydney and a Master degree of Business Administration from the Harvard Graduate School of Business. For his business career, he was a Managing Director of the bank's New York City office and later became a senior executive at Solomon Brothers. Currently, he runs his Wolfensohn & Company LLC, a private investment firm and advisory providing strategy consulting advice to governments and large corporations. Since 2005, he has also been the chairman of the International Advisory Board of Citigroup and an honorary trustee at the Brookings Institute. For his honors, since there are a lot, Mr. Wolfensohn has received numerous awards throughout his life. The recent one is University of New South Wales conferred an honorary degree of Doctor of Science in 2006. His successful initiatives are a lot as well. Let me name three of them: Comprehensive Development Framework, Development Dialogue on Values and Ethics, World Bank, and Anti-Corruption. His public service, as all of us know, Mr. Wolfensohn became president of the World Bank in 1995 and served the second 5-year term in 2000, becoming the third person to serve 2 terms in the position. During this term as president, he visited more than 120 countries around the world. Upon leaving the World Bank in 2005, he assumed the post of Special Envoy for Gaza disengagement for the Quartet on the Middle East until 2006. And also in 2005, he founded the Wolfensohn Center, a Washington DC-based think tank, and current projects focus on youth exclusion in the Middle East, large-scale anti-poverty programs, reforms of global economic governance, and regional cooperation, particularly in Central Asia. And this afternoon, he has brought with him a special speech called Beyond East, West, North, South, Peace and Prosperity in a 4-speed world. We look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Wolfensohn. The audience is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our spectacular keynote speaker, Mr. Jame D Wolfensohn.
No, I think this is fine. Unless you want me somewhere else. Is this all right? Mr. President and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be back in Bangkok and having the opportunity to speak to a subject that I care about a lot and which I know many people in this audience are concerned about. In case you think I have slides, I don't have any. So I don't, oh, there it is, that's me. My wife and I have had many pleasant opportunities to visit this country and are well aware of the environment in which we're now participating. And rather than dealing with the local politics, I thought I would deal a little more generally with Asia and with the subject that has been outlined to you, which is the so-called four-speed world. But before doing that, let me comment that the issues which I think are critical in Asia now are issues which very sadly have not adequately been assessed or addressed in North America or in Europe until relatively recently. Indeed, when I was growing up professionally in Australia and then in the United States, the whole emphasis of my colleagues and myself tended to be about what is going on in what we thought was the so-called developed world. It's the billion or so people today that live in the United States and in Europe and in other countries of the OECD, including Australia. And for us, the world more or less ended at the borders of this territory. My friend Toyo Gyoten, who, as I think many of you may know, is a distinguished Japanese civil servant who now is president of the Institute for International Monetary Affairs, commented rather pointedly, I thought, in a speech he gave in 1964, and rather than reading a lot, let me just read a little bit of this. He said, "I still remember vividly the day when I went to a meeting of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel. He said it was the year of the Cultural Revolution sweeping China. At the meeting of the BIS central bankers from the European countries were gathered largely for cocktails, luncheons and dinners, and talked endlessly about gold, the dollar, sterling, switching from English, French and German. There was absolutely no interest in China, no interest in India, and no interest in Asia. The Vietnam War was at a critical stage. The bankers had very little interest in such events. I thought uneasily that for these bankers, the world seemed still to end somewhere near the Dardanelles. And of course, that was the position that so many of the international bankers were adopting until recent years. Indeed, when I joined the World Bank some 12 years ago now, I found that in seeking to address the questions of development, it was not as easy as I had expected to be able to convince people that the future of the world was not going to be dependent on the billion or so people that lived in the so-called rich countries, but would be dependent on the other 5 billion people living in the developing world. And that unless there was some bridge of understanding, quoting from Mr. Morowitz today, some bridge of understanding and some steps that would be taken to bring about a link between those in the so-called rich world and those in the developing world, that we would be headed, in fact, for a very unfortunate period in the years ahead. The numbers, I think you know, are really quite important, and it's probably worth setting them out just at the beginning to give you the framework of what I'm concerned about. If you take the figures in roughly 2000, and I've rounded these numbers, you had roughly 6 billion people on the planet. 1 billion of them lived in the rich countries, and 5 billion of them lived in the so-called developing countries, which of course includes 4 billion or so in Asia, occupying a third of the world's land areas. But if you cast your mind forward to the year 2050, the best estimates that can be given, and no one is quite certain, but the sort of median estimates are, that you'll have a world not of 6 billion, but of 9 billion. And the billion or so that lives in the rich countries will grow by maybe 100 million. And the developing world will grow by 2.9 billion. So give or take, in the year 2050, we'll have a world which is close to 8 billion people living in what we call now the developing countries, and 1.1 billion or so in the rich countries. This is a dramatic shift in terms of population. But what is even more interesting is the trend that is likely to occur in terms of the share of the developing world, and indeed the share particularly of Asia, in terms of this move to new economic development. Truth is that in 1990, Asia accounted for roughly 8% of the world's GDP. By 2007, it was nearly 15%. And the best projections we have for 2050 are that it will be 57%. 57%. This is a dramatic change. Not historically, because in the year 1500 and the year 1820, China and India were roughly 50% of the global GDP. But with the Industrial Revolution, we saw a major change, a major shift to the United States and to Europe, and the position of Asia for the issues of the Industrial Revolution and the political issues with which you're very familiar, both in terms of the end of colonialism and the rise of communism. We saw a falling back of Asia, and then world wars changing the position of Japan as well. That is now reversing in a really dramatic way, and reversing even since the period of the 60s. I was reading in Bob Kagan's book, Dangerous Nation, of a visit of young Meiji reformers who were visiting the United States in 1960. And they came back, and in their report, they were commenting on the fact that in the United States they had flush toilets, which were not then adequately known in Japan. What a change in the intervening periods. We have the bullet train in Japan, and we see everything that has transpired in terms of technology in that country since that time. And so it is that the pendulum that swung to the United States and swung to Europe and to the OECD countries is now manifestly swinging back to Asia. And this is a realization that falls hard on, I think, many of my generation, because it wasn't like that. It's what not we grew up in. Asia was a place that you were nice to if you went there, but you stepped away from. If you wanted to get graduate work or education, you went to Europe. And dare I say it, that sadly today, less than 9% of the graduates of American universities come to Asia, and 65% still go to Europe, learning French and German and other languages. A change which I find quite disturbing, but which is in fact true. When I graduated in 1957 in Australia, I tried to get a scholarship to go to study in Asia. There were no scholarships. I discovered a university in Hokkaido in Japan which had a school of Commonwealth Studies. But I was late, and so unfortunately I had to go to Harvard instead. Which was not all that bad, I might tell you, from my career. That I might be Japanese today, I might even have a Japanese wife. After 46 years, and who knows what would have happened if that had happened. In any event, I didn't, and I went and I married a young lady from down the street in Wellesley, and we lived happily ever after. But that was not my first choice. I never admitted this in front of my wife until today. It was not my first choice. And so I went to study, and of course, as I entered my own professional career, it became very clear to me that the movement was in Asia. May I say the movement was in Thailand as well. If I can trust the UN statistics, and I'm never sure that I can, they do say that in the last 25 years, your country has moved the number of people living under $1 a day from 22% to 2%, and that's a fantastic move. If it's true, if it's nearly true, it's still a pretty good result. But I am aware of the differences in this country from my work in the bank between the rural areas and the city areas, and the need for additional development that exists here, as it does throughout Asia. On the other hand, as I again look at these statistics, again if I can believe them, poverty has been addressed, malnutrition significantly addressed, the Millennium Development Goals largely being achieved, child labor and infant mortality, vast improvements, significant improvements in clean water in your country, and certainly in the atmosphere in this city alone, and a move to universal primary education, which I was discussing earlier today. And in this last year, a continuation of the process of increased trade, which is moving well ahead, and may I say, in that increase in IT exports and a general feeling of an excitement in terms of economic development. And I just in passing want to say that you've done good work also in relation to AIDS. But what else has been happening in Asia? The other enormous switch that we've seen is what's happening with the global reserves. We now have roughly $5 trillion, $5,000 billion of global reserves. And what do we find? We find that of these reserves, the largest volume of reserves, as you know, is in China today, $1.5 trillion. And I won't bore you with the list, but as you run down the list, you become very conscious of the fact that the weight of the inclusion of these reserves is that more than 60% is in this region. And it looks as though China, talking to the finance minister last week, may add between 300 and 400 billion more in this coming year. And that is separate from the few $100 billion that they have tucked away in Hong Kong. So this is great, except the United States has opted for the order of 70 billion. As we look at this 1,600 billion, we come to the bottom of the list and find near the bottom the United States itself. This is, again, a dramatic change. And as we look at Japan, which ranks second on the list, and as we look at the accumulation of reserves in developing countries, we're seeing a change in balance in terms of the way the West was able to look at development, and in particular, the way the West was able to look at Asia. It is not any longer a series of countries that needs to be helped, where there is low labor cost and opportunity for exports. It is indeed a country that is now a capital provider for the rest of the world, which is a hugely significant shift even in the last decade. And the other thing that's happening is, I need hardly tell you in this part of the world, is the increase in the middle class, notably in China and in India. The numbers vary, and I don't know which ones to give you, but it's not impossible to say, and I think nor unsupportable to say, that in China we will have some 600 million people by the year 2025 that will have incomes ranging between $13,000 and $50,000 US in current terms. That is middle class. India, which started, as you know, later in terms of its own economic development, in terms of hitting the populace at large, India will have, according to the same McKinsey statistics, some 550 million people. 50 million they have at present, but growing to 550 million, growing 10 times by 2025. And so between these two countries, we have a new middle class which will exceed the middle class of certainly Europe, and will be an emotive force in itself to economic development. So it's no longer an Asia which is looking to export necessarily and solely to the United States or to Europe. It's a Asia which is growing rapidly itself, and where there is a counterbalance to what happens in that part of the world. And this growth has very significant consequences, because it also means that Asia is looking to other parts of the world itself as the engine driver, as distinct from something that follows. You only have to look at this last 2 years at what's happened in regard to Africa. Within the last 2 years, as you probably know, the Chinese government hosted the heads of government of Africa for their annual meeting. And I understand will host shortly a second one. That was a very unusual occurrence, but one which, according to my African friends who were at the conference, was better done than they've had it done anywhere else, and was superbly prepared, and which will continue to be prepared well, I'm sure, but which followed on freeing up by the Chinese of over $10 billion of loans, which they just forgave, and a program of between $5 and $10 billion for industrial development, which for any of you that have been to China would not be surprising. As you go in almost any African country today, and you find the town hall having been built by Chinese, the cultural center having been built by Chinese, and even when you get out into the countryside, as Elaine and I did recently in one of the African countries, looking at the prospect of housing development, finding 20 Chinese there as the locally chosen developer by an African who was our partner in that enterprise. So China is not letting Africa go, and of course there is an historic Indian population in Africa, particularly on the east coast of Africa, which makes that linkage extremely important and very, very real. The second thing that happened in this period was that 400 African businessmen, at the same time as the heads of state were meeting in China, they went to India. And the Indian government announced that it generated, and its private companies generated more than $10 billion of business at that meeting. This is a switch away from the paternalistic view of the United States and Europe towards Africa, where we have a new dialogue going and a new opportunity emerging between the countries of Africa and the countries of Asia, and in particular and notably China and India. I don't exclude the initiatives that might be taken by other countries, including your own, but it does represent also a challenge to this country, that the initiatives are being taken significantly by the two more populous countries of China and India. And it does represent a challenge to you in terms of your ability to compete in these other developing parts of the world. So we see absolutely clearly today a rise not only in Asia's activities within Asia itself, which I've touched on in relation to India and China, but also its outreach to other parts of the developing world in a way that was simply unknown a decade or so ago. And as we've seen, the change in the accumulation of reserves and the economic activity change. And this is all part of really what I've come to call changes in what is a four-speed world. And what is a four-speed world? It used to be that we had the developed world and the developing world. That was a two-speed world. If you were either rich or you were poor. And if you were rich, you stayed rich and gave something to the developing countries, not a hell of a lot. You pretended every year that you would give more, and the statistics showed that. But even today, the increases in US aid and European aid, if you look at them carefully, I have to say, are embarrassing in terms of the real flows of funding for development purposes. That's the subject of a different speech, but I'll be glad to come back next year and do that one. But it is a serious issue. But in the world as we have it today, it's not just the rich and the poor. There are really now four groupings of countries that we see, and it's important to look at them as four groupings because it gives a different insight on what we're going to face in the years ahead. They're the so-called leading countries, the OECD countries, if you like, with GDP per capita of 36,000 and above. And they have roughly 15% of the world's population. The so-called a billion people, 900 million people, the OECD countries. Then there's what I call the globalizers. These are the countries such as India and China, which are moving ahead at an extremely rapid rate They have incomes of less than $14,000, but they've got a rate of growth that's in excess of 3.5% a year. In the case of China, it's above 10% a year, or has recently been. In the case of India, close to that level. And those countries include India and China and Hungary and Indonesia and Kazakhstan and, dare I say, Thailand, as one of the countries that is growing at this sort of rate, and of course the Russian Federation and Malaysia amongst a list of some 30 odd countries. Then there are a group of countries which have come to be known as the rentiers. This is a country around 55 of them, with about 1 billion plus people in it, where the moderate per capita income is $4,000, largely due to high commodity prices, but where the growth rate is less than 3.5. In fact, in some cases, significantly less than 5%, 3.5% on a per capita basis, because birth rates tend to be high in these countries and growth relatively low. Those are the countries like Algeria, Argentina, Egypt, Iran, Libya. Mexico is in there, but I think will change. Syria, Venezuela, Turkey, and a bunch of other countries amongst the 55. Now those are countries that have reasonable growth, not falling backwards, but not perhaps growing as fast as the tier 2 countries that I mentioned, and will have a decent living, but where there, frankly, is not going to be a dramatic improvement in their competitiveness or in their economic activity. And then there are what I call the laggards. These are the countries significantly in Africa, which have within them, at the moment, 1 billion people, but which are growing very rapidly, and which will more than double in the next 30 or 40 years. In fact, as we project forward to 2050, we look at a world there where it'll be 25% of the world's population will be amongst these countries. Now that's an enormous number of people. The laggards, having a population of 9 billion people in the world, having 25% of that population, where the growth is simply not there, both as a result of their economic competitiveness and as a result of the increase in population and growth. That's where your problem comes in terms of international stability. And this is no longer a population significantly, about 80-85% of that population is in Africa. It's no longer a population that is uninformed. For any of you that have visited Africa, you will know that in almost every African village today, you have a wind-up radio, or you have, for many of the people, an earpiece, which they can have telephonic information about the price of crops for very little, and where they are linked to the rest of the country. This is no longer a completely ignorant group. This is a group that is now being linked, and you can see it in the jungles in Latin America, and you can see it in Africa. So this 2.5 billion people is no longer just a group that you can forget that it is over on the side somewhere. This is a substantial body of people on our planet where the opportunity for growth is simply not been achieved, and where the outlook for growth is not very good. What is happening as you see China and India reaching out is you see these countries, in Africa particularly, being used significantly for natural resource pools, for the mineral and mining rights. And if you're lucky enough to have oil, of course, you have a great advantage. But they're also being used as marketplaces for production from China and India. In these countries, they are not being used as places that can be where you can develop the manufacturing activity which will create the jobs. They're being used essentially as export markets. And so we have coming up a serious and significant issue that will divide our world into what I call this four-speed world. You'll have the world of, give or take, 1 billion in the rich world, of 4 billion in the next level, which is the China-India worlds. You'll have 1 billion or so in the next level of the moderately growing. And then you'll have a quarter of the population, 2.5 billion, in the African and other less developing countries. And this is a challenge for all of us, not just as a numbers game, because the numbers may vary and maybe we'll be out by 100 million or 200 million, or out by a decade or 5 years in terms of it. It's not the numbers game. The game that is of concern is the issue that it poses us in several areas. One is on inequality. And inequality in young people has a habit of leading to violence at a certain level of youthful unemployment and youthful frustration. And that's been proven historically time and time again. And the second thing is the environmental degradation. The environmental degradation which comes with poverty, and which is not limited, as we all know, to the geographic boundaries of these developing countries. Environmental degradation is something which is felt on a global scale, just as there is a challenge of poverty on a global scale. And so these are the issues which I think are now starting to be understood by the leaders of the world. It's no longer an issue just for the specialists or the do-gooders of the World Bank or the development institutions who talk about poverty and the need to address it. It's now becoming an issue which, because of global stability and because of environment, is an issue that is confronting the rich world in a way that has been obvious to me for some time, but which is now, thank God, being recognized by the leadership of the developed world. And we've seen this now in a number of ways. We've seen it with the ASEAN leaders coming together in preliminary meetings in the late 90s, and in 1997, the so-called Initiative for ASEAN Integration. This is a plan that had a 6-year life, and it was concerned to improve infrastructure, human resource development, information and communications technology, and regional and economic integration. And they were concerned not just with the rich countries, but also with the countries like Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, which are significantly behind, as you know. This is not just a 6-year plan that has been entered into because of the rhetoric of a few fiery leaders. It's been entered into because the leaders of the faster moving countries in these countries recognize that with interdependence between the countries in a very real way, and trade within the countries, and movement of people, and indeed physical danger between the countries, that this needs to be addressed not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of self-interest. It is a new conception of the region. Years back, in the 19th century, and in some parts of the 20th century, these issues were resolved by occupying a country next door and taking it to yourself. Today, the issue is resolved through trade. And there, thank God, has not been the aggressive feelings of country to country that we had in the last century and in the beginnings of this century. But if it's not there, then the question that arises is the question of income disparity and the question of stability based on economics. And that is the issue that I think is now of concern to the leaders around the world. One of them, interestingly, is Gordon Brown in England, who has been focusing on this for a decade, to my knowledge, and who has woken up, I think, a lot of the G7 leaders. But it's not just limited to Gordon, it is other leaders are now coming in, and what we're seeing is a new form of relationship that is emerging. I don't want to leave immediately the environment and get back on to economics, at least for a moment. But it is worth noting that 14 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are in China. And this issue of pollution is not just an issue for do-gooders and environmentalists. This has become a hugely serious economic issue, which I think all of us recognize. It exacerbates the issues of water, it exacerbates the ability to live, and may I say, in the cases of India and China, has led not just to major health problems, but to premature deaths. I asked someone to get out for me the figures last year in China as a result of the environmental degradation. And the numbers of last year put out by the government are between 350 to 400,000 premature deaths in China. 60,000 people died from diarrhea and other diseases, waterborne diseases. Economic cost to China, 2.7% of GDP. This is directly as a result of environment. So it's no longer perceived just as an issue for the do-gooders and the people who are rich enough to care about environment. But all of a sudden, I think, thank God now, the world is starting to listen that the environmental issue is not an issue for specialists or do-gooders. It is an issue at the very core of economic development. And the same is true for employment. I have some examples drawn from the Philippines, where environmental degradation in the lowland rain-fed areas led to massive declines in rice production. That pushed people to the highlands. The highlands, they found indigenous people who were already farming, so it led to conflict. And the conflict that arose between them then exacerbated even further poverty that there was in the area. I don't want to give you too many of these examples, but just hinting at them must make you understand that this is not a theoretical analysis. This is what happens when people lose their jobs. They go somewhere else to try and get jobs. They disrupt that local community and you lead to conflict. It's the oldest reason in the world to have conflict. But it still exists, and environment in this case is one of the clear examples of the way in which that is emerging. I might add that if I'm correctly informed, in your own city of Bangkok, you've done a pretty damn good job in dealing with the issue of environment, and I do warmly congratulate you on it. According to my information, it's better than any other Asian city. And that has to be true because the United States Environmental Protection Agency said so. I hope that it is true, and I hope that you enjoy for many years the results of the cleansing that we've had. But what other things are we now seeing in the region? First of all, we have seen that China is now taking a tremendously active role. And let me just tell you some statistics that you might find interesting, and which I find interesting because of my period in the World Bank and my period working with the G7. I was 6 years ago at the very first meeting that Jacques Chirac called, in which he invited leaders from the developing countries, not to attend the meetings of the G7, but to, maybe you were there, but to come for lunch and spend an hour after lunch. And we had at these meetings President Hu Jintao of China, the then Prime Minister of India, the leader, Mr. Lula from Brazil, and Thabo Mbeki, and I think Obasanjo of Nigeria. And they were each given 8 minutes to speak to the great leaders. And President Hu delivered a wonderful prepared speech. The President of India did the same, but it was a little difficult to understand his English, but I'm sure it was an excellent speech. And then President Lula, with a very good translator, spoke in Portuguese from Brazil. And he said something I thought was extremely funny. He said how wonderful it was to be there as the son of a very poor labor in Brazil, how he had been a union leader, and how great it was to be there in front of Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac and President Bush and all the other 8 leaders that were there. Then he said, but since I am here, may I issue an invitation to you that perhaps next year you might like to have your meeting in Rio or in Sao Paulo. Because you want to get used to it, because in another 15 years, the G7 is only going to contain 2 of you that are here now, which will be the United States and Japan. And on or about that time, the leading force in the world will be China. India will be number 3 after the United States. But then will be Japan. And then will be, in whatever order he gave it, the Brazils and the Mexicos and the Vietnams and the Indonesias, all of whom, as you know, will be part of the G10. So he said, I'd just like to invite you now. You don't have to learn Portuguese, but we'd like to have you come down and be with us, and maybe the following year we can do it in China, and the following year we can do it in India. It was greeted with a sort of laughter, but it was a faint laughter, because the truth is that in the G7 that was there, UK will not be in it, Germany will not be in it, France will not be in it, and, unless they're part of the European Union, which of course would merit a position in the top 8 countries. Now the importance of that was both amusing and politically very interesting, because it called into attention of the G7, I think, in a way that had not previously been possible, since they'd never been invited before, the fact that the world is being rebalanced, and a huge rebalancing in relation to Asia. And what we've seen in recent times is, I think, a move that confirms this in many different ways. First of all, the linkage and the recognition by China and Japan that historic rivalries have to be put out of the way, and if not forgotten, at least built upon in terms of moving forward. And we've seen in the last several years that Prime Minister Wen Jiabao went to China, and we've seen that the Japanese Prime Minister, President Fukuda, in December of 2007 went to China. I don't have the time to read you the totality of their speeches. They're available on the internet, but I read them very late last night because they're fascinating in terms of the way in which each leader reached out to the other great country in terms of trying to put behind them the issues of the past and talk about the interdependence that was there in terms of the future. In fact, one of the phrases was a new era where the past does not overshadow the present and the future, and talks of cultural and economic exchanges. Very, very clear indications from both leaders of the importance of this development. And development which, by the way, is important because of Japan's economic position in the world, but which needed to be followed up, as it was followed up, by similar meetings between China and India. You remember that China and India today represent more than a third of the world's population in 2 countries, 1.3 billion and 1 billion, out of a total of 6 billion people on the planet. And they will continue to occupy nearly a third of the planet in terms of the number of people that are there, with India moving ahead of China in terms of the number of people by the year 2025 because of the birth policy in China. But this issue of the overall growth in terms of this region, which, as I told you before, varies from the 80-20 of the rich countries and the developing countries, so that this region has nearly 60% of global GDP by 2050. This shift is something that the people of my generation is very, very hard to accept.